September 1976. Britain became the first developed Western nation to surrender control of its economy to foreign powers. Not through war, not through invasion, through a loan, the kind of loan third world countries took. The kind that came with conditions. The kind that changed who really decided how Britain would spend its money, who would work, and what the government could actually do. Most people think Britain just borrowed some cash and moved on. They're wrong. What happened in those closed-door meetings rewrote the rules. And the strangest part? The people who orchestrated it weren't even British. The pound had been falling for months. March 1976, it was worth $2. By September, $1.65. Every week, it dropped further. Every week, investors sold more. The Treasury tried to stop the bleeding, buying pounds with dollars they didn't have. The foreign exchange reserves were vanishing. Denis Healey, Chancellor of the Exchequer, was supposed to fly to a conference. He made it to Heathrow Airport, gin and tonic in hand, waiting in the VIP lounge. Then the call came. The pound was in freefall. He turned back, canceled the trip, went straight to Parliament the next day and announced Britain would be asking the International Monetary Fund for help. The largest loan ever requested from the IMF, $3.9 billion. The Wall Street Journal had already published its verdict. The headline that morning, "Goodbye, Great Britain." This wasn't just a financial crisis. This was a nation realizing it had lost the ability to govern itself. The IMF didn't just hand over money. They sent a mission to London. November 1976. A team of economists and officials who sat down with British ministers and delivered their terms. Deep cuts to public spending. Immediate, non-negotiable. The British cabinet fought for weeks. Left-wing ministers demanded rejection. They called it surrender. They said Britain should implement capital controls, seal the borders to money, build what they called a siege economy. But the truth was already clear to everyone in that room. The United States and Germany had been pulling the strings the entire time. Washington feared a broke Britain would lurch left, that it would endanger NATO, that it would destabilize the European economic community. They couldn't allow it, so they used the IMF as their weapon. The loan wasn't about helping Britain. It was about controlling what Britain would become. Behind the negotiations, American and German officials coordinated every move. They decided which conditions were acceptable. They decided how much Britain would be allowed to borrow. They decided what the British government would cut. And the British cabinet, split and desperate, eventually gave in. December 15, 1976. Denis Healey signed the letter of intent. Britain committed to £2.5 billion in spending cuts, around 2% of GDP. Council house construction programs, cancelled. Public investment, slashed. Social services, gutted. The economic philosophy that had governed Britain since World War II, the idea that you could spend your way out of recessions, that full employment mattered more than inflation died in that moment. James Callaghan, the Prime Minister, admitted it himself at a Labour Party conference just weeks before the deal. He stood in front of his own party and said, "We used to think we could spend our way out of trouble. That option no longer exists." It was a humiliation. But here's what most people miss. The IMF conditions weren't just about cutting spending. They were about changing who decided Britain's economic future. The IMF demanded supervision of British economic policies. That meant British ministers had to report back, had to prove they were following orders, had to get approval before making major decisions. For the first time in modern history, Britain couldn't govern its own economy without permission from international bureaucrats in Washington and Frankfurt. The Treasury had always resisted this kind of surrender. But inside the British government, there were people who wanted it. Denis Healey had already been cutting spending before the IMF arrived. The Treasury had been pushing monetarist policies, the idea that controlling inflation mattered more than protecting jobs for months. They used the IMF as political cover. It's easier to force through painful policies if you can blame foreigners. If you can say, "We have no choice." If you can claim the alternative is collapse. And so the IMF became the excuse for decisions that British politicians had wanted to make anyway, but couldn't sell to their own people. This was the moment Britain stopped being fully sovereign over its own economic destiny. Who were the people actually making these decisions? In Washington, Treasury officials who believed Britain's welfare state was unsustainable. That British unions had too much power. that the old Keynesian consensus, the post-war agreement to prioritize jobs and growth, was leading the entire Western world toward disaster. In Germany, policymakers who feared British chaos would spread across Europe, who believed discipline and austerity were moral necessities, who wanted proof that the Bretton Woods system of international economic cooperation could still enforce order. They encouraged the IMF to insist on strict conditionality. Britain tried to negotiate, tried to water down the terms, tried to get direct help from the United States and Germany to avoid the IMF altogether. Both governments refused. They wanted Britain to sign that letter of intent. They wanted the conditions locked in. They wanted the precedent established. Because this wasn't really about Britain. It was about proving that even developed Western nations had to follow the new rules. That no country, no matter how historically powerful, could escape the discipline of global capital markets. The markets had voted against Britain. The markets had decided British policies were unsustainable. And now international institutions controlled by American and German interests would ensure Britain changed course. This was a geopolitical power play disguised as a rescue mission. The IMF loan worked. Technically, sterling stabilized almost immediately after the agreement was signed. Confidence in the pound was restored, huge inflows of capital returned to Britain. By 1977, the economy was growing again. The current account improved. Britain didn't even need the full amount. They only drew part of the loan and repaid it quickly. Some economists later claimed the whole crisis was manufactured, that the Treasury had exaggerated Britain's problems to justify cuts they wanted anyway, that the pound would have stabilized on its own. We'll never know for certain. But what we do know is this: the crisis broke something inside British politics. The Labour Party tore itself apart. The left felt betrayed. The trade unions, who had supported Labour for decades, watched the government/public sector jobs and impose wage caps to fight inflation. In 1978 and 79 came the winter of discontent, a wave of strikes that paralyzed the country. Garbage piled up in the streets. Hospital workers walked out. The dead weren't buried. Britain looked ungovernable. And in 1979, the Conservatives won in a landslide. Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. Thatcher didn't create the policies that came to define her era out of nowhere. The groundwork had been laid in 1976. Denis Healey had already adopted monetarist policies. He'd already cut public spending and sold off government shares in British Petroleum. Thatcher just took those ideas and supercharged them. Privatization of nationalized industries, deregulation of financial markets, crushing the power of trade unions, lower taxes on the wealthy, higher taxes on everyone else. By 1990, more than 40 state-owned businesses employing 600,000 workers had been privatized. Over £60 billion of state assets sold. British Telecom, British Airways, British Gas, the railways, water, electricity, all transferred to private ownership. The narrative was about efficiency, about giving ordinary people a chance to own shares, about creating a property-owning democracy. But here's what actually happened. The proportion of UK shares held by British citizens kept falling. Meanwhile, the proportion owned by foreign interests quadrupled during Thatcher's years, then quadrupled again afterward. Britain's public assets ended up controlled by foreign governments and international investors. The very outcome, the 1976 crisis, was supposed to prevent Britain losing economic control to foreign powers, became permanent policy. The City of London bankers who underwrote these privatizations made billions. Investment banks earned over £3 billion in fees. They made even more in trading gains. To them, Thatcher and her ideology were useful. They provided political legitimacy for what was essentially a transfer of wealth and power from the British public to private financial interests. The 1976 crisis had opened the door. It established the principle that markets could veto government policy, that international financial institutions could impose conditions on sovereign nations. Thatcher walked through that door and never looked back. Think about what changed. Before 1976, British politics operated under a consensus. Both major parties agreed the government's job was to maintain full employment, to provide public services, to manage the economy, to avoid both inflation and mass joblessness. After 1976, that consensus was dead. The policy orthodoxy shifted to fiscal discipline and monetary controls. Inflation became the primary target. Unemployment, an acceptable price. By 1984, unemployment hit 3.3 million more than double what it was when Thatcher took power. Britain's child poverty rate became the highest in Europe. But the markets were satisfied. The pound recovered. London became a global financial center. The city boomed while industrial towns crumbled. This wasn't a natural evolution of economic thinking. This was a political project, executed through crisis, legitimized by international pressure, and sold to the public as inevitability. The people who controlled the IMF, who sat in the US Treasury, who advised the German Ministry of Finance, they rewrote the rules for how Western economies would function. They didn't need armies, they didn't need occupation, they just needed one country to break first. One country desperate enough to accept conditions. One country that would prove the model could work. Britain was that country. The 1976 crisis set the template. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, governments across Europe faced the same choice Britain faced in 1976. Accept austerity or lose access to credit markets. Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, all of them went through their own IMF moments. All of them faced teams of foreign economists who arrived with conditions. All of them had to prove they were serious about cutting spending before markets would lend to them again. The pattern Britain established became the standard procedure for managing national crises in a globalized economy. And the British public? Most still don't understand what really happened in 1976. They remember Thatcher. They remember the strikes and the privatizations. They remember the arguments about whether it was necessary or ideological. But they don't remember the moment when Britain stopped being the one making its own decisions. They don't remember that the economic policies which transformed Britain didn't come from British voters or British politicians or British economists. They came from a conference room where American and German officials used a debt crisis to impose their vision of how Western economies should work. Look at what happens step by step. A country faces an economic crisis. Markets lose confidence. The currency collapses. International institutions arrive with rescue loans. But the loans come with conditions. Conditions that change how the government operates. Conditions that benefit certain interests over others. The government accepts because the alternative looks worse. The policies get implemented. The crisis stabilizes. But the government that emerges from the crisis is fundamentally different from the one that entered it. It serves different priorities. It answers to different masters. And the people? They're told this was all inevitable, that there was no other choice, that anyone who opposed the changes was naive or dangerous. This is how power shifts without anyone noticing it's happening. Britain, in 1976, wasn't the first time this pattern played out. It wasn't the last time either, but it was the most important time. Because Britain proved that even the most powerful nations, nations that had once ruled empires, nations that had won world wars, could be brought to heel by their creditors. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. What's remarkable is how quickly Britain forgot what actually happened. Within a few years, the story became about Thatcher's strength and Labour's weakness, about unions being too powerful and industry being too inefficient, about the inevitable march of free market economics, the part where foreign governments used financial leverage to rewrite British economic policy, that got quietly dropped from the narrative. Maybe because it was too uncomfortable. Maybe because both political parties had played along. Maybe because admitting it would raise questions nobody wanted to answer. Questions like, if international financial institutions could override a sovereign government's decisions in 1976, what's stopping them from doing it again? Questions like, who actually controls British economic policy when markets can collapse the currency and force a change in direction? Questions like, what does democracy mean when elections can't change the fundamental rules of economic management? These questions never got asked in public, and when they did, they got dismissed as conspiracy thinking or anti-globalization paranoia. But the questions remain. The Treasury had predicted the deficit would be £10.5 billion. It turned out to be £8.5 billion. Denis Healey was furious at how badly his own economists had miscalculated, which raises one last uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the crisis wasn't as severe as the Treasury claimed. Maybe the cuts weren't as necessary as the IMF demanded. Maybe the whole thing was an engineered opportunity to force through changes that couldn't have passed otherwise. We know the Treasury wanted those changes. We know the US and Germany wanted them. We know the IMF pushed for them harder than economic conditions required. Was 1976 a genuine crisis? Or was it a crisis of confidence manufactured, exaggerated, then exploited? The answer probably lies somewhere in between. But the exploitation was real. The transfer of power was real. The changes it locked in were real. And Britain never got that power back. Today, when people talk about Britain's economy, they debate tax rates and spending levels and trade agreements. They argue about Brexit and immigration and productivity. But they don't talk about who actually has the power to make the big decisions. They don't ask whose interests British economic policy serves. They don't question whether Britain is truly sovereign or just going through the motions. Because in 1976, something fundamental changed. Something most people never noticed. Something that shaped everything that came after. Britain learned that being broke means surrendering control. That international markets have veto power over domestic politics, that some decisions are too important to be left to voters. And once you learn that lesson, you can never unlearn it. The question isn't whether it will happen again. The question is whether anyone will recognize it when it does. Because the pattern is still there, the institutions are still there, the leverage is still there, and the people who understand how to use a crisis, they're still there too, waiting for the next country to break.